What if humans weren't the first advanced civilization on Earth, but the ones who came after? According to ancient Sumerian texts, powerful beings known as the Anunnaki once ruled the world. But some theories go even further, claiming their empire lasted for over 200 years before humans ever existed. These beings were said to possess advanced knowledge, influence early civilizations, and possibly shape the course of human history itself. But is this based on real ancient records, or a modern reinterpretation of myth? In this video, we explore the mystery of the Anunnaki Empire and the theory that Earth may have once been ruled long before humanity began. Before the first dynasty of Egypt ever raised a stone, before the great flood that nearly wiped the world clean of memory, before the first king sat upon a throne, before the first farmer pressed seed into soil, before the wheel turned, before fire was deliberately made, before all of that, something else ruled this planet. Something older, something that came not from this world but from the sky. They are called the Anunnaki, and according to ancient Sumerian records, some of the oldest written texts on the face of the earth, they did not merely visit our planet. They governed it, they engineered it, they shaped its continents, mined its minerals, seeded its oceans, and eventually, in an act so audacious it defies comprehension, they created us. The ancient texts are explicit. The numbers are staggering. According to the Sumerian king list, a clay tablet that modern archaeologists have dated to somewhere around 2100 BCE, the gods ruled the earth for 241,200 years before the Great Flood came and before what we call recorded human history began. 200 years. Let that number breathe for a moment. The entirety of recorded human civilization, from ancient Sumer and Egypt to the digital age we live in today, spans only about 5,000 years. The Anunnaki, if the ancient texts are to be believed, ruled this planet for a period 48 times longer than everything we call history. They were here when our species was being dreamed into existence. They were here long before we could dream at all. This is not mythology. This is not legend. This is what the clay tablets say, and tonight we are going to read them. The Library Beneath the Sand. The story of the Anunnaki doesn't begin in the stars. It begins in a museum, several museums in fact, in London, in Baghdad, in Philadelphia, in Istanbul, where tens of thousands of clay tablets, recovered from the sands of ancient Mesopotamia beginning in the mid-19th century, sit catalogued and translated, telling a story that most of us were never taught in school. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard began excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the legendary ancient city on the outskirts of modern-day Mosul in northern Iraq. What he found beneath the earth would change our understanding of antiquity forever. Buried within the ruins of the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, Layard and his team uncovered the remains of one of the most extraordinary libraries ever assembled in the ancient world. The Library of Ashurbanipal. Over 30,000 clay tablets, many of them copies of texts far older than the Assyrian Empire itself. Texts that trace their origins back thousands of years further to the civilization that invented writing itself, the Sumerians. Among these tablets was a collection of stories so ancient, so detailed, and so structurally complex that scholars initially struggled to believe they were reading religious mythology at all. These were the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predated the biblical account of Noah's flood by at least 1,000 years, and scattered throughout hundreds of other tablets, the names, the deeds, the genealogies, and the cosmic mandates of beings called the Anunnaki. The word itself is Sumerian, Anunnaki. Scholars have translated it in several ways over the decades, but the most compelling and most persistent translation is simply this: those who came from heaven to earth, or, in some scholarly readings, those of royal blood who descended from the sky. Both translations point toward the same extraordinary conclusion. These were not earthly beings, they came from somewhere else. The Sumerians themselves were remarkably clear about this. Their texts do not say the Anunnaki were metaphors. They do not say they were dreams or visions or spiritual abstractions. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki the way we might write about a foreign government, with names, ranks, specializations, disputes, and political hierarchies. They described their physical appearance, their emotions, their needs, their mistakes. The Anunnaki ate food and drank beer. They fell in love and went to war. They made decisions they later regretted. And at the center of everything they did was a single, consuming motivation: gold. Why gold? We'll get to that. But first, who were they? The royal family of the stars. The Anunnaki were not a nameless mass of divine beings. They were a civilization, a royal dynasty with a family tree as intricate and as politically volatile as any ruling house in human history. At the top of that dynasty sat a being known as Anu. Anu was the king of the Anunnaki. His name literally means heaven in Sumerian. He was the supreme authority of their home planet, a world the ancient texts refer to in several ways, but which the great Sumerian scholar and author Zechariah Sitchin, working from the clay tablets throughout the latter half of the 20th century, identified as a planet in our own solar system on an extended elliptical orbit. Sitchin called this planet Nibiru, a name that does appear in the ancient Mesopotamian astronomical texts, though its precise identification remains one of the most debated topics in alternative scholarship. Anu did not come to Earth himself in the early period of the Anunnaki's presence here. He governed from afar from his celestial throne, but his sons, and this is where the story becomes as rich and as dramatic as anything Shakespeare ever wrote, his sons came to Earth and they hated each other. The first son was Enki. In Sumerian, his name means Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Deep. He was Anu's firstborn son by a concubine, meaning that despite being the eldest, he was not the legal heir to his father's throne. That honor went to Enlil, Anu's son by his half-sister. And under Anunnaki law, as the Sumerian texts describe it, it was the son born of the same father and the same royal bloodline mother who inherited dominion. Enlil, though younger than Enki, was therefore the legal heir and the commander-in-chief of the Anunnaki mission on Earth. This single fact, that Enki was older but Enlil was legally superior, created a rivalry between these two brothers that would last for hundreds of thousands of years, reshape the surface of our planet, and ultimately determine the fate of the human race. These were not simply two gods who disagreed. They were two profoundly intelligent, powerful beings with utterly opposed philosophies. One who loved humanity and one who viewed humanity as a tool. And both of them, in different ways, made us who we are. Enki was the scientist, the geneticist, the engineer. Ancient texts describe him as brilliant, playful, deeply interested in the natural world, and fiercely protective of the beings under his care. He is associated with the deep waters, the Abzu, the underground fresh water that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the surface of the earth. He is credited with designing the irrigation systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. And most extraordinarily, he is credited with designing humanity itself. Enlil was the administrator, the military commander, the one who kept order and enforced the laws handed down by Anu. He was, by many accounts in the ancient texts, suspicious of humanity, resentful of the attention Enki paid to the new species, and ultimately the one who decided, when the time came, that the Great Flood should be allowed to wipe humanity from the earth. Between these two, there was a third major figure, Ninhursag, also called Ninti, Ninma, or Mami. She was Anu's daughter, half-sister to both Enki and Enlil, and she was the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki mission on Earth. She was also, according to the ancient texts, the one who literally carried humanity to birth, the one in whose body the first humans were gestated before the Anunnaki had engineered a way to use human surrogates. And then there were the children, Marduk, Enki's son, who would eventually seize control of the Anunnaki order and establish the city of Babylon as his domain. Inanna, also called Ishtar, the granddaughter of Enlil, fierce and ambitious and sexually magnetic and utterly terrifying when crossed. Nergal, lord of the underworld. Ninurta, Enlil's son and the great warrior of the Anunnaki. Thoth, known to the Sumerians as Ningishzida, and to the Egyptians as the god of wisdom and writing, and Utu, also called Shamash, the god of the sun and of justice. These are not merely mythological characters. The Sumerians recorded their activities with the precision of historical chroniclers. Their texts describe legal proceedings, military campaigns, agricultural projects, and mining operations with the kind of practical detail that is difficult to explain if these stories are purely allegorical. Something very specific was being remembered here, something real. The arrival, 445,000 years ago. The Anunnaki did not arrive on Earth all at once. The ancient texts describe a mission, a staged, deliberate colonization effort that unfolded over thousands of years. And the reason they came, the driving force behind the entire enterprise, was something we pull out of the ground every day and wear on our fingers without a second thought: gold. According to Zechariah Sitchin's translations of the Sumerian text, translations that remain controversial among mainstream scholars, but that Sitchin developed over decades of meticulous work, the Anunnaki's home planet was facing an environmental catastrophe. Their atmosphere was deteriorating. Their scientists had determined that the solution was to create a reflective shield of gold particles suspended in their upper atmosphere, a cosmic sunscreen essentially, similar to the reflective aerosols that Earth's own scientists have proposed in recent decades as a method of combating climate change. Gold could save their world, but their own planet had insufficient deposits. They needed a source, and their surveys of the solar system identified a planet rich beyond calculation in the precious metal, Earth. The first Anunnaki to land on Earth arrived approximately 445,000 years ago, according to the ancient texts. His name was Enki. He came with a small crew. The texts call them the first 50 Anunnaki, and he landed in the Persian Gulf, which in that ancient era was a shallower body of water than it is today. He called his first settlement Eridu, which in Sumerian means home away from home, or more poignantly, the good city. The name Eridu appears in both the Sumerian king list and in modern archaeological records. An actual ancient city called Eridu has been excavated in southern Iraq, and it is considered by mainstream archaeology to be one of the oldest known cities on Earth. The coincidence, if coincidence it is difficult to ignore. Enki initially believed the gold could be extracted from the waters of the Persian Gulf, which were rich in dissolved minerals. But the quantities weren't sufficient. The real deposits were in Africa, specifically in the ancient gold fields of what is now South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the surrounding region. We know from modern geological surveys that this region contains some of the oldest and most substantial gold deposits on the planet. The ancient gold mines of Monotapa, located in modern Zimbabwe, have been carbon dated to extraordinary antiquity. Some estimates suggest that mining in that region began at least 100,000 years ago, and some researchers have pushed that date back considerably further. The question is, who was doing the mining? The Anunnaki answer is the Anunnaki themselves, at first. And this is the crux of the story. This is the pivot point around which all of ancient history revolves, because the Anunnaki had been mining gold for tens of thousands of years, and the workers, the junior Anunnaki, the Igigi as the texts call them, those of the Anunnaki rank who labored in the mines, eventually had enough. They rebelled, and that rebellion forced the ruling class of Anunnaki into a decision of world historical consequence. If the Igigi would no longer work the mines, they needed to find another kind of worker. And so Enki, the scientist, the geneticist, the one who loved this planet and understood its living things, was tasked with creating one. The genetic workshop, creating humanity. The ancient Sumerian text known as the Atrahasis epic is, in many ways, the most staggering document ever recovered from the ancient world. Written in Akkadian, the language that succeeded Sumerian, but derived from earlier Sumerian sources, it tells the story of how humanity was created in a level of detail that reads less like mythology and more like a laboratory report. The text is explicit. The Anunnaki were laboring in the mines of Africa, growing increasingly resentful, increasingly exhausted. The Igigi, the lesser Anunnaki who did the physical work, had been digging canals and working the gold fields for what the text describes as 40 periods of 3,600 years each. That is 144,000 years of labor. And they had reached their breaking point. Led by a figure whose name is lost to us, but who is described simply as their foreman, the Igigi set fire to their tools, surrounded Enlil's quarters in the middle of the night, and refused to work. Enlil, furious, demanded to know who had organized the rebellion. But the Igigi had agreed, if they were punished, they would all claim responsibility. No single being would take the fall. It was a labor strike. It was a union action. It happened 300,000 years ago, and it changed everything. Enlil, humiliated and outmaneuvered, called a council. Enki had a proposal. He had been studying the native life of this planet for thousands of years. Its flora, its fauna, its primate populations. He had noticed something extraordinary. Among the hominids of Africa, there was a species of exceptional promise, not quite human, not quite ape, but somewhere in between, with hands already adapted for tool use, with a brain already capable of rudimentary problem solving, with a social structure that suggested the capacity for cooperation and communication. The texts describe what came next with breathtaking specificity. Enki proposed the creation of a Lulu Amelu, a mixed worker, a being that would be formed by combining the essence of the existing primate species with something else, something Anunnaki, something divine. Ninhursag, the chief medical officer, would serve as both co-architect and surrogate. The ancient texts describe a process that is disturbingly reminiscent of what we today would call genetic engineering combined with in vitro fertilization. An egg from the native creature, the hominid, was fertilized with something the texts call the essence or blood of a young Anunnaki male. This fertilized cell was then developed in a way the texts describe as being fashioned in the image of the Anunnaki and then implanted in the womb of Ninhursag herself for gestation. The first attempts failed. The texts are graphic in their description of miscarriages and malformed offspring, beings born without limbs, without eyes, with organs on the outside of their bodies. These early experiments are almost certainly the origin of the myths about monsters that appear in so many ancient cultures: the Minotaur, the Cyclops, the Centaur. Beings that were neither one thing nor the other, the discarded prototypes of a laboratory still learning. But eventually, after many attempts, Enki and Ninhursag succeeded. The first Lulu, the first successful prototype human, was brought into the world. The ancient texts record Ninhursag's cry of joy at the result. "I have created, my hands have made it." This is almost certainly the origin of the Sumerian creation texts that later filtered into the biblical narrative, the cry of the creator at the completion of their work. And it was good. This first human could not reproduce. The texts are very specific about this. The early Lulu was what we would today call infertile. It was a deliberate choice, a worker, not a breeder. It could be produced in controlled batches, in the wombs of Anunnaki females who served as surrogate mothers, but it could not multiply on its own. This was a feature, not a flaw. The Anunnaki wanted workers, not a competing civilization, but the demand for workers grew. The mines needed more labor. More surrogates were required. And Enki, brilliant, compassionate, always pushing the limits of what his brother and his father had decreed, took the experiment one step further. He gave humanity the ability to reproduce. The biblical story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, described in Genesis as a fruit that opened their eyes and made them, like gods, knowing good and evil, is, in Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian original, a mythologized retelling of this moment. The knowledge that was forbidden and then given was sexual reproduction, the capacity to bring forth life from themselves without Anunnaki intervention. The serpent who gives humanity this gift is Enki himself, and significantly, Enki's symbol in Sumerian iconography is the intertwined serpents that we recognize today as the caduceus, the symbol of medicine. The being who gave humanity the ability to reproduce was the same being who had created them. and he was the divine physician. Enlil was furious. He had wanted workers, not a new species with the power to fill the earth, the power to grow, the power to eventually rival the Anunnaki themselves. His anger at Enki's unauthorized modification of the human genome is the source of the divine wrath in the Garden of Eden narrative, and his decision to expel humanity from the garden, from the controlled Anunnaki settlement where the first humans had been housed and cared for, into the wider world, was the biblical expulsion. Cast out of paradise, sent into the world to labor and to multiply, told that they would suffer, that they would know pain in childbirth, that the ground would not give up its fruit without toil. These were not punishments from a vengeful God, they were the conditions of the outer world, harder, colder, less managed than the Anunnaki settlement, and they were the beginning of humanity's long and terrible and extraordinary journey toward becoming what we are. The Garden of the Gods, the Anunnaki city network. While humanity was multiplying across the surface of the earth, the Anunnaki were building. They were not a primitive occupying force. They were an advanced civilization with technology that modern archaeology struggles to explain, and in many cases simply doesn't address. The ancient Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki establishing a network of cities across the region that is today the Middle East. The first and most sacred of these was Nippur, the command and control center of the entire Anunnaki Earth operation, the city where Enlil himself presided. The texts describe Nippur as the location of the Dur and Ki, the bond between heaven and earth, a communication facility that linked the Anunnaki on the ground with their orbiting spacecraft and with their home planet. Other cities followed, Sippar, where the sun god Utu Shamash maintained the spaceport that the texts describe as being located in the cedar forest of Lebanon and later in the Sinai Peninsula. Shuruppak, the medical center, overseen by Ninhursag. Lagash, Enki's operational headquarters in the south. Bad Tabira, the metallurgical center. And Larak, the mission control center. These were not merely cities in the human sense. They were functional installations, each with a specific purpose in the Anunnaki infrastructure. The ancient texts describe them as being laid out in a precise geometric pattern, with the Nippur command center at the middle of an elaborate grid. And when modern researchers have plotted the ancient Sumerian city locations on a map, they have found something remarkable. They align in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidental, oriented toward fixed astronomical positions that would only be relevant to beings who needed to land and launch aircraft with precision. The architecture of these cities also defies conventional explanation. The Sumerians, who are credited by mainstream archaeology with being the first urban civilization, emerging seemingly from nowhere around 3500 BCE, built temples called ziggurats. These massive stepped pyramid structures are described in the ancient texts not as places of worship in the human sense, but as the residences and operational platforms of the Anunnaki themselves. The god lived in the ziggurat. The top of the ziggurat was the landing platform. The lowest levels were the processing and storage facilities. This is not a fringe interpretation, it is what the texts say. And then there is the question of the technologies the Anunnaki employed. The ancient texts describe flying vehicles in extraordinary and sometimes almost comical detail. The Sumerian term is mu, or shem, and these are described as elongated, rocket-like craft that could travel between cities, between continents, and into orbit. They describe weapons of devastating power, beams of light that could turn stone to dust, that could level cities in moments. They describe tools that could cut rock with precision no ancient copper chisel could achieve. And they describe communication devices that allowed beings in one part of the world to speak with beings in another, or with beings on other planets entirely. Modern scholars of ancient Mesopotamian texts have long grappled with how to interpret this material. The default academic position has been to read all of it as metaphor, to say that the Sumerians were describing natural phenomena, lightning, wind, the sun, in the language of divine beings, because that is how pre-scientific people understood the world. But this interpretation requires the reader to accept something increasingly difficult to swallow, that the Sumerians, who were, by every other measure, extraordinarily practical and detail-oriented record keepers, chose only when it came to their gods to abandon specificity and precision in favor of pure allegory. Everything else the Sumerians recorded was practical: legal codes, commodity prices, agricultural measurements, trade records, mathematical equations. Why would the same people who recorded the price of barley in meticulous detail also record purely fictional stories about beings who came from the sky in flying vehicles and built cities and created humans? And why would they record those fictional stories with the same dry, administrative tone as the price of barley? The answer, for a growing community of researchers and scholars, is that they wouldn't. What the Sumerians recorded was what they remembered, what had been told to them, what their ancestors had experienced, and what they were describing was history. Ancient, overwhelming, terrifying history, rendered into the only narrative framework they had, the language of gods. The divine kingship, how the Anunnaki ruled through humans. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Anunnaki ruled Earth directly. They walked among the wildlife and the wilderness of the ancient world, built their cities, ran their mines, and managed their human workers. But as the human population grew, as Enki's gift of reproduction spread humanity across the face of the earth in numbers no one had anticipated, direct management became increasingly difficult. The Anunnaki devised a solution. They would rule through intermediaries. They would choose certain humans, specific individuals from among the most capable, the most intelligent, the most physically impressive, and elevate them, train them, educate them in the arts of governance and administration, and then install them as kings, as representatives of divine authority, as the link between the ordinary mass of humanity and the Anunnaki themselves. This is the institution the Sumerian king list calls the descent of kingship from heaven. The ancient text is precise. Before the flood, kingship was given to humanity by the Anunnaki. It was not a human invention. It was handed down from on high, along with all the other elements of what the Sumerians called Me, civilization itself, the arts of writing, mathematics, law, metallurgy, agriculture, textile production, music, architecture. All of it, according to the Sumerian texts, was a gift from the Anunnaki, given to humanity to organize and elevate the species the Anunnaki had created. The kings who received this mandate were not ordinary humans. The ancient texts suggest they were often of mixed heritage, part human, part Anunnaki. They lived extraordinary lifespans. The Sumerian king list records pre-flood kings who ruled for thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, the first king, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years, and Menluana ruled for 43,200 years. These numbers strike modern readers as absurd, impossible. Lifespans of tens of thousands of years are biologically inconceivable for human beings. But what if those kings were not fully human? If the Anunnaki lived for hundreds of thousands of years, and the ancient texts suggest this was indeed the case, that their biology operated on a fundamentally different timescale than ours, then the early kings, who carried significant portions of Anunnaki genetic material, may well have lived for centuries or even millennia, as the dilution of Anunnaki bloodlines continued across generations, as these mixed heritage kings had children with fully human partners, and those children had children, and so on. The extraordinary lifespans gradually shortened. This is precisely what the Sumerian king list records: a progressive decline in the length of reigns from the pre-flood era to the post-flood era, from tens of thousands of years to hundreds of years to decades, as the Anunnaki genetic material became increasingly diluted. After the flood, the longest-lived king in the Sumerian king list is Etana of Kish, who ruled for 1,500 years. Still impossible by modern biological standards, but vastly shorter than the pre-flood kings. Then Enmebarajesi, who ruled for 900 years. Then shorter and shorter until we reach figures like Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, according to his own epic, who ruled for 126 years and was devastated by the discovery that he could not achieve immortality. Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life, the centerpiece of one of the oldest and most moving pieces of literature ever written, is the story of a man who knew that something had been taken from him, who understood that his ancestors had lived in a way he never would, who undertook a journey to find the last of the long-lived beings and demand the secret of their longevity, and who ultimately failed because the gift of extreme longevity was not in Gilgamesh's genetic inheritance. It had been bred out, diluted, the divine blood was too thin. This is perhaps the saddest theme in all of ancient literature, the memory of a time when humanity, or something close to humanity, lived differently, longer, more fully, in closer contact with beings of immense power and knowledge, and the slow, terrible realization that that time was gone. The Anunnaki Wars, divine conflict on Earth. The Anunnaki were not a peaceful civilization. The ancient texts describe them as brilliant, powerful, intensely political, deeply emotional, and frequently violent. And the conflicts between Anunnaki factions, wars fought with weapons of devastating power over territories, over influence, over the fate of humanity, left marks on the archaeological record that mainstream scholarship has never satisfactorily explained. The greatest of these conflicts came toward the end of the Anunnaki's visible presence on Earth, in the period that the ancient texts place around 2000 BCE, though the events described suggest a technological scale of destruction that seems inconsistent with anything human civilization was capable of at that time. The trigger was a dispute over power. Specifically, it was a dispute between Marduk, Enki's son, ambitious and brilliant and convinced that he was destined to rule the earth, and the other Anunnaki who had controlled the key territories. Marduk had been making his move for centuries. He had established his base in Babylon, built his temple there, gathered followers both Anunnaki and human, and positioned himself as the supreme lord of the known world. His ambitions brought him into direct conflict with Inanna, also called Ishtar, who controlled the Indus Valley civilization and was not prepared to yield her territories without a fight, and with Enlil's son Ninurta, the great warrior, who had his own claims and his own loyalties. The ancient texts describe a series of catastrophic events during this period. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, those legendary cities of the plain, destroyed by what the Bible describes as fire and brimstone from heaven, is described in Zecharia Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian texts as a deliberate act of Anunnaki warfare. The 7 weapons of terror described in the ancient texts, used by Nergal and Ninurta in the decision to deny Marduk control of the Sinai spaceport, have all the hallmarks of nuclear or directed energy weapons. The cities of the plain are not merely burned, they are obliterated. The earth beneath them is scorched. The people inside them are turned, the text says, to salt, pillars of salt, as if the intense radiation of whatever weapon was used desiccated the human body instantly. The archaeological record in the southern Dead Sea region, where the biblical cities of the plain are traditionally located, contains something remarkable. A layer of ash and charred material dating to approximately 3600 to 2000 BCE, spread across a substantial geographic area. The destruction appears sudden, total, and consistent with an event of enormous thermal energy. This is not a campfire. This is not a volcanic eruption. There are no volcanoes in that region. This is something else. Something that current archaeological models do not explain. And the consequences extended beyond the cities themselves. The ancient texts describe the cloud of radiation. They call it the evil wind, blowing from the destroyed Sinai Peninsula northward across Mesopotamia, poisoning the land, killing the crops, filling the rivers with a bitter taste. The great city of Ur, one of the crown jewels of Sumerian civilization, fell at almost exactly this time, around 2000 BCE, and the Sumerian lament for its fall describes not conquest, but something far stranger. The people fled not from an army, but from something in the air, something invisible, something that killed plants and animals and humans alike, that no wall could stop, that came on the wind. This is the lament for the destruction of Ur. It is one of the most heartbreaking documents from the ancient world, and it describes, in agonizing detail, what sounds exactly like the aftermath of a radioactive event. The cattle lie dead without visible wounds. The people's bodies are piled in the streets not from spear or sword, but from something in the very air they breathed. The god Enlil himself is described as having decided that Ur's time was over. as having directed the evil wind toward the city with deliberate intent. Mainstream scholars have long attributed the fall of Ur to the invasion of the Amorites, a nomadic people from the northwest. But the lament for Ur does not describe an invasion in any way that matches known patterns of ancient warfare. It describes something far more total, far more absolute. When Marduk finally prevailed, when he established his supremacy over the other Anunnaki and his city of Babylon became the center of the known world, he was inheriting a civilization in ruins. The Sumerian era was over. The great cities that the Anunnaki themselves had founded, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Shuruppak, were abandoned or destroyed, and the Anunnaki themselves were withdrawing. Their physical presence on Earth was ending. The era of direct divine rule was coming to a close. Why? This is one of the great unanswered questions. The ancient texts do not provide a single clear explanation, but several factors seem to have converged. The gold mining operation had, by this point, been running for more than 400,000 years, an extraordinary span of time even by Anunnaki standards. The situation on Earth had become increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to manage. The human population was enormous, billions or close to it, and the Anunnaki's ability to control or guide such numbers was diminishing. The wars between Anunnaki factions had destabilized the entire operation, and, perhaps most importantly, humanity was developing in ways that made the Anunnaki relationship with us profoundly uncomfortable. We were asking questions. We were building our own temples, our own institutions, our own cosmologies. We were becoming, in the words of the ancient texts, too noisy, too present, too much. We were no longer just workers. We were becoming a civilization. And the Anunnaki, for reasons the texts hint at but never fully explain, decided it was time to go. The Great Flood, an act of genocide or something worse. Of all the events recorded in the Anunnaki narratives, none is more dramatic, more terrifying, or more consequential than the decision to allow, or cause, a global flood that would exterminate most of humanity. The flood story in the Bible, Noah, the Ark, 40 days and 40 nights, is one of the most famous narratives in human history, but it is not the original telling of this event. The original is in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, in the Atrahasis epic, and in the story embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the original, the decision to flood the earth is not the act of a just God punishing wickedness. It is a political decision, a pragmatic elimination, and it is deeply, terribly cruel. The ancient texts are blunt. Enlil decided that humanity had to be destroyed, not because humans were wicked, not because they had sinned in a moral sense, but because there were too many of them, and they were too loud, and they disturbed his rest. The Atrahasis epic uses a Sumerian word, rigmu, that translates as noise or clamor. Humanity had become too populous, too noisy, too present. Enlil could not sleep, and his solution was elimination. He was not alone in this decision. A council of the great Anunnaki voted on the matter and agreed. The flood was coming, a natural event, the texts suggest, a massive inundation associated with the return of the Anunnaki home planet to its closest orbital approach to Earth, generating tidal forces of catastrophic magnitude, was known in advance. The Anunnaki had predicted it, and Enlil's decision was not to warn humanity, not to help them prepare, to let them die. Enki objected. Enki always objected. He could not vote against the council's decision. The political structure of the Anunnaki did not allow it, and he had sworn an oath of secrecy. But Enki, as he always did, found a way around the letter of the law while honoring its spirit. He could not warn humanity directly, but he could speak to the walls of a house. He went to a reed house, the home of a man named Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, and Noah in the Hebrew. And he spoke to the walls, and through the walls the man inside heard. And Enki, speaking to the walls, gave those walls very specific instructions. Build a vessel, make it watertight, gather your family, gather pairs of living creatures, gather seed of every kind, prepare, the waters are coming. The parallels with the biblical Noah story are so exact, so precise, that they cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The biblical story was written thousands of years after the Sumerian original. The Hebrew scribes who compiled Genesis had access to Babylonian traditions. The Jews had spent decades in Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, in direct contact with the literary heritage of ancient Mesopotamia. The flood story they brought home with them was a version of the same story that had been recorded on clay tablets for thousands of years. The difference is in the interpretation. In the Sumerian original, the decision to flood the earth is not just, not holy, not righteous. It is the act of a powerful being who found humanity inconvenient. And Enki's defiance of that decision, his choice to save one family, one genetic lineage, enough seed stock of every living thing to rebuild the world, is arguably the most heroic act in all of ancient literature. The flood came. The texts describe it with the kind of terrible specificity that only eyewitness accounts, or very old memories of eyewitness accounts, tend to have. 7 days and 7 nights in the Akkadian version. The waters above and below, both rainfall of unprecedented intensity and the rising of underground water tables, the fountains of the deep, as the Bible puts it. The land submerged, the sounds of human civilization extinguished one by one until there was only water. When the waters receded, when the ship grounded on a mountain that the Sumerian texts identify as Mount Nazir and the biblical text as Ararat, Utnapishtim, Noah, sent out birds to test whether the land was dry. This detail too is in the Sumerian text. The raven, the dove returning with an olive branch. These images that have become the universal symbols of peace and new beginnings are not originally Hebrew images. They are Sumerian. They are the memories of one family, preserved against all odds on a boat in the middle of a drowned world. And then, in a detail that the biblical version omits, but that the Sumerian and Akkadian texts preserve, when the water receded and Utnapishtim emerged and made offerings and burned incense, the gods gathered like flies around the smoke of the offering. They were hungry. The destruction of humanity had also destroyed their source of food, the agricultural products that human labor produced, the offerings that human worship provided. The gods, the texts note with extraordinary candor, had made a mistake. They had destroyed what they needed, and they would not make that mistake again. Enlil was furious when he discovered that Enki had saved a human family, but the argument Enki made was irrefutable. Humanity was necessary, the Anunnaki needed them, and the punishment for the ones responsible for the near extinction of the species, for allowing the flood to be kept secret from those who could have prepared, was that humanity would be divided. Some would be fertile, some would be barren, some would die young, life expectancy would be curtailed. The extraordinary lifespans of the pre-flood era would not be restored. Humanity would live shorter lives, producing more offspring, but knowing less, weaker, more dependent. It was a compromise, a terrible, cold-blooded compromise that has shaped human existence ever since. After the flood, the rebuilding, and the second civilization, the world that emerged from the flood was not the world that had existed before it. The great Anunnaki cities of the pre-flood era were buried under meters of silt. The carefully maintained irrigation networks, the agricultural systems, the administrative structures, all of it had to be rebuilt from nothing. And this time, the Anunnaki did something they had never done before. They taught humanity how to do it themselves. Not all of it, not the deepest knowledge. The ancient texts are very clear that certain arts were never shared. The knowledge of genetics, of spacecraft construction, of the communication technologies that linked Earth to the stars. But the practical arts, writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, astronomy, all of these were transmitted to humanity in the post-flood period with a generosity that the pre-flood Anunnaki had never shown. Why? Because the Anunnaki's time on Earth was ending. They were preparing to leave. And before they left, they needed to set up humanity as a self-sustaining civilization, one that could maintain itself, that would continue the work of civilization, that would keep the gold flowing and the temples maintained and the memory alive. The post-flood period, roughly 10,000 BCE to 3000 BCE in conventional archaeological terms, is precisely when we see the most extraordinary and inexplicable flowering of human civilization. Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the oldest known towns, appears around 7500 BCE with no visible developmental period. Fully formed, organized, already capable of agriculture and symbolic art. Göbekli Tepe, the remarkable temple complex in southeastern Turkey that has upended our understanding of human prehistory, was built around 10,000 BCE by people who had no agriculture, no pottery, no metal tools, and yet somehow managed to erect massive T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons with extraordinary precision. No one can satisfactorily explain how. The ancient Egyptians, whose civilization appears in the archaeological record with the same suspicious suddenness, built the Great Pyramid of Giza with a degree of mathematical and engineering precision that remains, in certain specific ways, beyond the capability of modern construction, not because we lack the technology, but because the margin of error in the original is so vanishingly small that replicating it would require a commitment of precision that no modern building project has ever been required to match. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north to within 0.05 degrees. Its base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across an area of 13 acres. The internal chambers are cut with tolerances measurable in fractions of a millimeter, and it is made of 2.3 million stone blocks, averaging 2.5 tons each, with some blocks weighing up to 80 tons. These are not the accomplishments of a civilization in its infancy. These are the accomplishments of a civilization that received instruction. The ancient texts support this. Thoth, known to the Sumerians as Ningishzida, one of Enki's sons, is credited in both Egyptian and Sumerian sources with designing the pyramids, not as tombs, as mainstream archaeology has maintained for centuries. The Great Pyramid was never used as a tomb, no mummy was ever found there, no inscription was ever carved on its interior walls, but as functional structures, energy structures, communication structures, structures whose alignment with the stars of Orion's belt, as researcher Robert Bauval demonstrated in the 1990s, corresponds not to the night sky of 2500 BCE when the pyramid is conventionally dated, but to the night sky of approximately 10,500 BCE. The same period that ancient Egyptian tradition describes as the first time, the era of the gods, when divine beings ruled Egypt directly. In South America, in the pre-Inca city of Tiwanaku on the shores of Lake Titicaca, massive stone structures made of blocks weighing hundreds of tons are assembled with interlocking joints of such precision that not even a razor blade can be inserted between them. The stones had to be cut and shaped before they were moved into position because the tolerance requirements were too fine to achieve after assembly. And the culture that built them, the Tiwanaku people, have left us, in their own symbolic records, stories of divine beings who came to that high plateau and taught them everything they knew. These convergences, across cultures separated by oceans, across timelines separated by millennia, all pointing to a period between 10,000 and 3000 BCE, when something transmitted extraordinary knowledge to the human species, are the archaeological footprint of the Anunnaki's final, departing gift to the civilization they had created. The legacy in the genes. If the Anunnaki created humanity through genetic engineering, if they combined their own genetic material with that of an existing primate species to create Homo sapiens, then we should expect to find the evidence in our own bodies. And here, the scientific record becomes genuinely extraordinary. In 2013, a team of geneticists made an announcement that received remarkably little mainstream attention given its profound implications. They had identified a set of genes in the human genome that appear, by every measure of evolutionary analysis, to have no antecedent. These genes, they identified 145 of them in their initial study, could not be traced back to any known ancestral species. They did not appear in Neanderthals. They did not appear in Denisovans. They did not appear in any of the archaic human species whose DNA has been recovered and sequenced. They appeared, as far as the researchers could determine, without evolutionary precursor in modern Homo sapiens. The researchers attributed this to horizontal gene transfer, a process by which genetic material from another organism is incorporated into a host genome without traditional reproduction. This is a real biological mechanism. It happens, for example, when viral genetic material becomes incorporated into a host's genome over generations. But the specific genes in question, genes involved in complex neurological function, immune response, and metabolic processes unique to Homo sapiens, are not the kind of material that typically arrives via viral horizontal gene transfer. They are sophisticated functional sequences with no analog in any organism on Earth. The implications are stunning. If these genes did not evolve on Earth, if they have no earthly precursor, then where did they come from? This is precisely what the ancient Sumerian texts describe: the insertion of foreign genetic material into the human genome, not through natural evolution, through deliberate engineering. And the genetic evidence for Anunnaki intervention does not stop there. Humanity, uniquely among Earth's primates, has 23 pairs of chromosomes. Our closest genetic relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all have 24 pairs. We are missing a pair. Or more precisely, we have a chromosome, human chromosome 2, that appears to be the result of a fusion of two ancestral primate chromosomes. The evidence for this fusion is clear and scientifically accepted. Chromosome 2 contains the remnants of telomeric sequences in its interior, sequences that should only appear at the ends of chromosomes, exactly where a fusion event would have welded two separate chromosomes into one. This fusion event reduced our chromosome count from 24 to 23. It is not a random mutation. It is the kind of precise chromosomal manipulation that modern genetics can perform in a laboratory, but that natural evolution would have no mechanism to produce randomly. If a chromosome fusion of this kind occurred spontaneously in a single individual in a wild primate population, that individual would be reproductively isolated, unable to produce fertile offspring with a normal 24-pair mate. The fusion would die with them. For the fusion to become species-wide, it would have to appear simultaneously in a population large enough that fused individuals could find other fused individuals to mate with. The probability of this happening spontaneously through random mutation in the wild is astronomical, unless it happened in a laboratory, unless it was done deliberately. The Anunnaki texts describe the creation of the first human as a genetic procedure performed in a controlled environment. If that procedure involved the deliberate fusion of primate chromosomes, perhaps to disable specific behaviors, enhance others, modify the cognitive architecture of the existing primate brain in particular ways, then the telltale evidence of that procedure would be sitting in every human cell on Earth, right where it is, in the center of chromosome 2, a scar of the surgery that made us. Beyond the chromosomal evidence, there is the extraordinary speed of human cognitive evolution. The human brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the center of abstract reasoning, language, planning, and self-awareness, expanded at a rate that evolutionary biologists acknowledge is difficult to explain by natural selection alone. The selective pressures that would have driven rapid brain expansion in the African savanna environment, while real and meaningful, do not fully account for the extraordinary overshoot of cognitive capacity that Homo sapiens displays. Our brains are dramatically, disproportionately larger and more capable than anything our prehistoric environment strictly required. Unless they were designed that way, unless they were engineered to specifications set by beings who needed a worker capable of following complex instructions, using advanced tools, and eventually managing the civilization they were leaving behind. The withdrawal. Where did the Anunnaki go? At some point between 2000 and 1000 BCE, the gods stopped walking among us. The specific interactions between individual Anunnaki and individual humans, the meetings in temples, the divine appearances, the physical encounters described in the ancient texts, fade from the record. The gods become more distant. Their voices are heard, but their forms are not seen. And then, gradually, even the voices stop. What happened? Where did the Anunnaki go? The ancient texts offer several clues, though none of them provide the complete picture we would want. What they suggest, collectively, is a withdrawal that was both strategic and gradual. A deliberate stepping back from direct involvement in human affairs, motivated by a combination of factors. The most compelling explanation in the ancient texts relates to the wars. The Anunnaki Wars of the 3rd millennium BCE, culminating in the destruction of the Sinai spaceport and the catastrophic events that ended the Sumerian civilization had left the Anunnaki's Earth-based infrastructure in ruins. The spaceport was gone. The command center at Nippur was buried. The cities the Anunnaki had built and managed were either destroyed or occupied by the exploding human population in ways that made their original function unrecognizable. Without the spaceport, without a reliable means of leaving Earth and returning, the Anunnaki were in a precarious position. The texts suggest that at least some of them were effectively stranded for a period, forced to operate with diminishing resources and infrastructure. This may explain the gradual nature of their withdrawal rather than a single decisive departure. But there is also a more philosophical dimension to the withdrawal. The ancient texts suggest that the Anunnaki, as humanity grew and flourished and began to develop its own culture and its own understanding of the cosmos, recognized something they had not anticipated, that their creation had exceeded its design parameters. Humanity was not merely a worker species. It was a genuinely creative, genuinely curious, genuinely spiritual species, one that was reaching, with increasing insistence, for the same kinds of questions the Anunnaki themselves asked. Questions about origin, about purpose, about the nature of reality. Some of the Anunnaki, Enki, chief among them, regarded this with delight. It was, from his perspective, the ultimate vindication of his creation. Others, Enlil, and the more conservative members of the Anunnaki Council, regarded it with alarm. A worker species that asks philosophical questions is a worker species that will eventually demand rights, that will eventually look at the gods and say, "Why are you gods and we are not?" The Anunnaki's response to this existential challenge was to withdraw, to become less visible, to transition from direct rule to indirect influence, from appearing in physical form to appearing in visions and dreams and the internal voice of prayer. To become, in a word, what we call gods in the modern sense, invisible, all-knowing, beyond reach, knowable only through faith. This transition is recorded in the ancient texts as a series of leavings, moments when individual Anunnaki departed from specific locations and were not seen again. Enlil leaving Nippur, Enki leaving Eridu, Marduk ascending to his secret dwelling. These are not the deaths of mortal beings. These are the withdrawals of beings who had somewhere else to go. And the texts hint, though they never quite say it directly, that the somewhere else was up, back to the sky, back to the world they had left hundreds of thousands of years before, laden with the gold they had come to collect, carrying with them the knowledge of what humanity was and what humanity was becoming. They left, but they did not forget us. The ancient texts record promises, divine covenants, made to humanity at the moment of departure, promises to return, promises that the knowledge and the law and the structure of civilization they had established would endure. Promises that the relationship between the Anunnaki and their creation was not ended, only transformed. The great religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and dozens of others, are, in this reading, humanity's attempt to maintain a relationship with beings who have withdrawn from direct contact. Prayer is the attempt to reach beings who no longer answer in an audible voice. Ritual is the repetition of practices established in a time when the presence was real. The sacred texts are the memory of encounters so profound, so overwhelming, so beyond ordinary human experience that they had to be rendered in the only language available, the language of the divine, of the holy, of the transcendent. This is not a cynical reading of religion. It is, in some ways, a more respectful one. The prophets were not hallucinating. The encounters described in the Old Testament, in the Vedas, in the Quran, in the sacred texts of every tradition, the voices, the visions, the burning bushes, and the whirlwinds, and the pillars of fire were real encounters with real beings who were, in the full meaning of the Sumerian term, Anunnaki, those who came from the sky. The Sumerian king list, decoding the 241,200 years. We need to spend time with this extraordinary document, because the Sumerian king list is not merely a list of rulers. It is the timeline of the Anunnaki presence on Earth, encoded in a framework that modern readers initially dismissed as absurd, but that, on closer examination, reveals a profound internal logic. The Sumerian king list begins with these words: "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." From this starting point, it lists the kings of the pre-flood era with their impossibly long reign lengths, then describes the flood itself, then continues with the post-flood kings in whose reign lengths gradually compress to the historically verifiable. The pre-flood section gives us 8 kings, in some versions 10, with total reign lengths that add up to 241 to 200 years. This is not a round number. It is not 250,000 or 200,000. It is 241 or 200, and that specificity is itself significant. Someone counted, someone kept a record. The number was not invented for dramatic effect. It was computed from actual records that, somewhere in the administrative archives of the Anunnaki mission on Earth, existed. How do we interpret those reign lengths? The individual numbers are given in a unit called a shar, which equals 3,600 years, the same number as the years in the orbital period that Sitchin attributed to the Anunnaki home planet. If the shar is indeed an orbital period, a year as experienced on a planet with a 3,600 Earth-year orbit, then the reign lengths of the pre-flood kings, translated into Anunnaki years, become perfectly ordinary. Alulim's 2080-800-year reign becomes 8 Anunnaki years. Alalgar's 36,000 years becomes 10 Anunnaki years. These are not extraordinary lifespans. These are normal political tenures for beings who live on a different timescale. And 241,200 years of Anunnaki rule on Earth becomes, in Anunnaki time, approximately 67 Anunnaki years, not an eternity. A colonial mission of about 2 human generations in duration, from the Anunnaki perspective, long enough to establish infrastructure, extract resources, create a workforce, set up a self-sustaining civilization, and then go home. The mathematics are elegant. They are internally consistent, and they align, remarkably, with the geological and archaeological evidence for when significant changes began to occur in Earth's biosphere and in the trajectory of human evolution. 300,000 years ago, within the period that the Anunnaki texts describe as the time of the genetic engineering project, is also the period that modern paleoanthropology identifies as the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The fossil record shows an abrupt appearance of modern human anatomy in Africa at approximately this time, with features that do not have a clear gradual evolutionary precursor in the preceding fossil record. The brain size, the skeletal proportions, the facial structure, they appear, in geological terms, suddenly. The mainstream explanation is that the evolutionary pressures of the African environment produced rapid selection for these traits. The alternative explanation, the one encoded in the Sumerian clay tablets, is that someone made us this way, deliberately, for a specific purpose, and that the emergence of modern Homo sapiens in the fossil record at approximately the same time that the Anunnaki texts describe the creation of the Lulu worker is not a coincidence. It is a receipt. The hidden knowledge, what the Anunnaki left behind. The Anunnaki did not leave empty-handed, but they also did not leave without leaving something behind. Not everything, not the most dangerous knowledge, but enough. The ancient texts describe, in several places, a moment of decision about knowledge, about how much of what the Anunnaki knew should be transmitted to the humans who would remain after their departure. This is encoded in the Sumerian concept of the Me, pronounced May, the divine tablets or objects that contain the blueprints of civilization. The Me were not metaphors. They were physical objects that contained encoded information, the fundamental principles of every art, science, and institution that made civilization possible. The story of Inanna's acquisition of the Me, in which she tricks Enki, who is drunk on beer, into giving her the Me to take back to her city of Uruk, is one of the most entertaining stories in all of Sumerian literature. But beneath the comedy is a profoundly important transmission event. Inanna, the Great Queen, is carrying civilization itself, the knowledge of writing, of metalworking, of music, of law, of architecture, from the Anunnaki to humanity. What exactly did the Me contain? The Sumerian texts provide a list, and it reads like a curriculum: lordship, godship, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the exalted shrine, the royal insignia, the exalted resting place for priesthood, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the art of prostitution, the art of the forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of adorning, the art of truth-telling, descent into the underworld, the musical instrument, music, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, the art of metalworking, the scribe's art, the smith's craft, the leatherworking craft, the building craft, the basket weaving craft, and more and more and more. This is not a religious text. This is an inventory, and what it describes is the deliberate transmission of every art and craft and institution of civilization from the Anunnaki to humanity, not discovered by us, not evolved by us, given, transmitted, encoded in objects that contain the information the way we today might encode an entire library in a digital storage device. Some of those transmissions were more selective than others. The ancient texts hint at a body of knowledge that was deliberately withheld, the deepest understanding of genetics, of time, of the physics underlying Anunnaki technology. This knowledge was given not to humanity in general, but to a specific lineage, a priesthood, a mystery school, a chain of initiates who were sworn to preserve it in coded form until the time came when humanity would be ready to receive it openly. This is the origin of every esoteric tradition in human history. The Egyptian mystery schools, from which Greek philosophy derived its deepest insights, the Pythagoreans and their mathematical cosmology, the Kabbalah and its encoded structure of divine emanations, the Hermetic tradition and its insistence that certain knowledge can only be transmitted under oath of secrecy to initiates who have demonstrated readiness. The Freemasons, with their mysterious references to the lost word and the great architect of the universe, the Rosicrucians, the Gnostics, all of them, from one perspective, are guardians of something that was given to a select group of humans by beings who were departing, and who left instructions that the knowledge should be preserved, encoded, protected, and transmitted across the centuries until the day humanity was ready to hear it plainly. That day perhaps is approaching. Modern echoes, the Anunnaki in contemporary science. Here is the extraordinary thing about the Anunnaki narrative. The further humanity has pushed the frontiers of science into genetics, into astrophysics, into quantum mechanics, into the deep history of our own species, the more we keep finding things that the ancient Sumerian texts already knew. We have already discussed the chromosomal evidence, the fusion of chromosome 2, the unexplained genes in the human genome. But there is more. In 2001, the Human Genome Project completed its initial sequencing of the entire human genetic code. Among the findings that received little public attention was the discovery that human DNA contains what geneticists call junk DNA, sequences that appear to have no functional role in coding for proteins that account for approximately 97% of the entire genome. The initial assumption was that this non-coding DNA was evolutionary debris, the accumulated remnants of ancestral genetic sequences that had been superseded and were now inert. But subsequent research has overturned this understanding. The so-called junk DNA is not inert. Much of it consists of regulatory sequences that control when and how the coding genes are expressed. Some of it consists of what are called transposable elements, sequences that can, under certain conditions, copy themselves and insert themselves into new positions in the genome, acting as dynamic agents of genetic change. And some of it, a portion that has not yet been satisfactorily explained, consists of sequences of extraordinary complexity that appear to contain information encoded in ways we do not yet know how to read. If the Anunnaki created humanity by inserting their own genetic material into a primate genome, we would expect to find exactly this: a human genome in which the active coding sequences, the ones that make us physically human, are a small fraction of the total genetic information present, with a vast surrounding structure of additional genetic material whose function we do not yet understand. We would expect, in other words, exactly what we find. The field of epigenetics, the study of how environmental and experiential factors can switch genes on and off without altering the underlying DNA sequence, has revealed that human beings carry within them a far greater range of potential expression than our ordinary lives tend to actualize. The same genetic code can produce dramatically different outcomes depending on epigenetic factors, and some epigenetic researchers have suggested that this extraordinary range of latent genetic potential, the fact that human DNA appears to contain far more capability than any ordinary human life accesses, is a mystery that standard evolutionary theory does not well explain. Unless the genome was designed to contain more than we currently use, unless the full range of human genetic potential was intentionally encoded into us by beings who knew what we might need over a very long period of time, who built in capabilities for environments and circumstances that had not yet arrived. In astrophysics, the search for Planet 9, a hypothetical large planet on a very eccentric orbit in the outer solar system, whose existence has been inferred from the orbital perturbations of trans-Neptunian objects, continues. The orbital parameters proposed for Planet 9 by scientists like Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown at Caltech bear a striking resemblance to the orbital characteristics that Zecharia Sitchin described for the Anunnaki home planet, based on his reading of the ancient Sumerian astronomical texts, a very large body on a very extended elliptical orbit with a long period of several thousand years. Sitchin proposed this in 1976. The scientific evidence for a large unknown planet in our outer solar system began accumulating in earnest in the 2010s. This does not confirm the existence of the Anunnaki home planet, but it suggests that the ancient Sumerian astronomical knowledge, which mainstream scholarship has largely attributed to mythology, may have contained real observational data about the structure of our solar system, data that our own science is only now beginning to catch up with. And then there is the question of ancient nuclear events. The Thar Desert in India, the location that ancient Indian texts describe as the site of the great battle of the Mahabharata, in which divine weapons of fire and lightning destroyed entire armies, has been found to contain a layer of radioactive ash at a depth consistent with an event approximately 8,000–12,000 years ago. The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, was abandoned around 1900 BCE under circumstances that archaeology has never satisfactorily explained. Some of the skeletal remains found at the site show signs of radiation exposure. The bones are among the most radioactive naturally occurring human remains ever found, and the city's abandonment appears sudden, total, and without the gradual decay that typically precedes the fall of ancient cities. These are not fairy tales. These are physical realities, measured by instruments, reported in peer-reviewed archaeological literature, and they fit with uncomfortable precision into the narrative of the Anunnaki Wars, divine conflicts fought with weapons of catastrophic destructive power, the return, prophecy, and the future. The Anunnaki did not say goodbye. Not permanently. The ancient texts, across virtually every culture that retained memory of the divine beings who once walked the earth, record a promise: they will return. In Sumerian mythology, the concept of a returning divine ruler, a king whose departure was temporary, whose absence was a grief to the people he had governed, whose return would inaugurate a new golden age, is present from the very earliest texts. It is embodied in the figure of Dumuzi, the shepherd king beloved by Inanna, who is taken to the underworld and whose annual return is the myth behind the changing of the seasons. It is present in the prophecies associated with Marduk's exile and promised return to Babylon. It is present in the ancient Sumerian concept of the Milam, the divine radiance that descends from heaven when a god or a great king appears. In Egypt, the concept of the returning divine king was so central to the culture that the entire funerary tradition of the pharaohs, the mummification, the pyramid texts, the Book of the Dead, was organized around it. The pharaoh, in death, was expected to join Osiris, the Sumerian Enki in Egyptian dress, in the afterlife, and eventually return to rule again. The star shafts in the Great Pyramid, 4 narrow passages aimed with extraordinary precision at specific stars, are now understood to be aligned with the stars of Orion, Sirius, and the circumpolar constellations. These were not decorative, they were directional. The ancient Egyptians were showing someone the way back. In the Hebrew tradition, the messianic prophecy, the expectation of a divine or semi-divine figure who will return and inaugurate a new age of justice and peace, is the defining theological concept of the entire biblical narrative. Jesus, for Christian tradition, was that returning figure. For Judaism, he has not yet come. For Islam, the figure of the Mahdi fulfills a similar role. Every Abrahamic religion carries within it the memory of divine beings who once walked among us and the expectation that they will walk among us again. In Hindu tradition, the Kalki avatar, the 10th and final avatar of Vishnu, who has not yet appeared, is expected at the end of the current age, the Kali Yuga, to arrive on a white horse with a blazing sword and restore the world to the purity and divine order of the first age. The Vedic concept of the 4 yugas, cosmic ages of declining spiritual quality, describes a cycle that began in a golden age when divine beings and humans coexisted openly, and that will end when the divine beings return. In the indigenous traditions of the Americas, the Mesoamerican concept of the return of Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec feathered serpent god who was white-skinned and bearded and who promised to return from the east, the Incan concept of Viracocha, the creator god who taught civilization and then departed across the Pacific, promising to return, the same pattern appears: a divine teacher, a departure, a promise of return, a calendar counting the years until that return. These are not disconnected myths. They are the same story, told in 100 different languages across 100 different cultures, all drawing on the same fundamental memory, that beings of extraordinary power and knowledge were here, that they left, and that they said they would come back. The Anunnaki, if the ancient texts are to be believed, are not gone. They are waiting for the human experiment to reach a phase of development that makes the next chapter of the relationship possible. Waiting for us to be ready, not just technologically, but spiritually, philosophically, as a civilization, for the reunion that the ancient texts promise is coming. What would that reunion look like? The ancient texts are ambiguous on the details, but consistent on the broad strokes. It would be a time of extraordinary upheaval, preceded by chaos and conflict. A time when the hidden knowledge, the ME encoded in the mystery traditions, the genetic potential latent in the human genome, the full capability of the human mind, would be unlocked and activated. A time when the stars would again be crossed by the vehicles that crossed them before. And a time when the question that has haunted humanity since the first human mind was capable of asking it, where did we come from and why are we here, would finally, definitively, be answered. The skeptic's case and why it matters. We have spent most of this exploration in the territory of the ancient texts, the alternative archaeology, and the speculative synthesis that writers like Zecharia Sitchin brought to global attention. Before we conclude, we owe it to ourselves and to the complexity of this subject to engage seriously with the objections. The mainstream scholarly critique of Sitchin's work is substantial. Most Assyriologists, the academic specialists in ancient Mesopotamian languages and cultures, have criticized his translations as inaccurate, arguing that his readings of key Sumerian and Akkadian terms are not supported by the established scholarly understanding of these languages. Michael Heiser, one of the most prominent academic critics of Sitchin, spent years demonstrating specific translation errors in Sitchin's work. Instances where Sitchin rendered a word as rocket or spacecraft that standard Assyriology translates quite differently. These are real criticisms. Sitchin was not an academic Assyriologist. He was a scholar in the broader sense, deeply read, serious, committed to his work. But his translations departed from established scholarly consensus in ways that his critics consider unsupportable. The question of whether Nibiru was a planet on an extended elliptical orbit or simply a term for a particular celestial event or position is genuinely contested. Similarly, the mainstream archaeological consensus on the origins of Homo sapiens attributes our emergence to evolutionary processes rather than genetic intervention. The unexplained genes in the human genome, the chromosomal fusion, the rapidity of human cognitive expansion, Mainstream science has explanations for all of these, though scholars would acknowledge that some of those explanations are more satisfying than others. And the ancient flood narratives, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the radiation evidence in the Thar Desert and at Mohenjo-Daro, mainstream archaeology and geology have natural explanations for all of these as well. Floods happen, cities fall. Ancient radiation can have geological sources. The human tendency to mythologize natural events, to see the face of a powerful divine being in every earthquake and storm, is well documented. So why does the Anunnaki narrative persist? Why does it grow in cultural reach and in the number of people who find it compelling despite mainstream scholarly dismissal? The answer, perhaps, is in the nature of the questions it asks, not its specific answers. Those can be debated, criticized, revised, but the fundamental questions it puts on the table. Where do we come from? Why are we the way we are? Why does the human genome contain so much more than we use? Why did civilization appear with such apparent suddenness in so many places? Why do the ancient texts of so many unconnected cultures describe divine beings from the sky with such similar specificity? These are real questions. They deserve serious answers, and the mainstream scholarly consensus, while intellectually rigorous and empirically grounded, has not yet provided answers that fully satisfy the depth of the mystery. The Anunnaki narrative, whatever its flaws, has the virtue of taking the ancient texts seriously on their own terms, of treating the Sumerians not as primitive myth makers, but as intelligent observers, recording what they knew and remembered, of asking what the ancient records might tell us if we read them not as allegory but as history. That is a worthy project, even if the specific conclusions remain contested, because the alternative, treating the oldest written records of the human species as nothing more than the fanciful inventions of prescientific minds, does not honor the intelligence of the people who made them, and it may, in closing that door prematurely, cost us access to knowledge about our own origins that we have not yet found any other way to recover. The 241-200-year timeline, a summary. Let us place the entire Anunnaki narrative on a timeline so that the scale of what the ancient texts are claiming becomes viscerally clear. 445,000 years ago, Enki arrives on Earth with the first 50 Anunnaki, establishes Eridu in what is now southern Iraq, begins the gold extraction project. 430,000 years ago, the second wave of Anunnaki arrives under Enlil. The two brothers establish their respective areas of operation. Enlil takes command of the Earth mission from Nippur. Enki is assigned to oversee Africa and the gold mines. 400,000 years ago, the network of Anunnaki cities is established in Mesopotamia. The infrastructure of the mission is in place. The Igigi labor in the mines of Africa. 300,000 years ago, the Igigi Rebellion. The genetic engineering project begins. Enki and Ninhursag developed the prototype human in a laboratory environment. After multiple failed attempts, the first successful Lulu is created. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appears in the fossil record of Africa. 250,000 years ago, humans begin to multiply. The initial sterile prototype is modified by Enki to allow sexual reproduction. The human population begins to grow across Africa and the Middle East. 200,000 years ago, human populations expand out of Africa. The Anunnaki city network manages a growing human workforce. Kings of divine human mixed heritage govern human populations on behalf of the Anunnaki. 100,000 years ago, the period of the great Anunnaki, the era of direct rule that the Sumerian king list records, the pre-flood kings, lifespans of thousands of years, direct interaction between Anunnaki and humans. 50,000 years ago, human populations reach all corners of the habitable world. Culture, symbolic art, complex language, and sophisticated tool use emerge. The Neanderthals disappear. Modern Homo sapiens becomes the sole hominid species on Earth. 13,000 years ago, signs of catastrophic disruption. The Younger Dryas impact event or similar catastrophe changes Earth's climate and may correspond to the period that precedes the Great Flood in the ancient texts. 11,600 years ago, approximately 9600 BCE, the Great Flood, the Anunnaki withdraw from the surface of the Earth as the waters rise. One family, Utnapishtim Ziusudra, Noah, is warned by Enki and survives in a sealed vessel. The flood recedes. Humanity begins again from a tiny remnant. 10,000 BCE, 3000 BCE. The Anunnaki return to the surface in diminished numbers. They assist humanity in rebuilding civilization. The knowledge of agriculture, architecture, writing, and law is transmitted to the human survivors. The post-flood kings emerge. The great ancient civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the early Chinese civilization, the Olmec of Mesoamerica, all flourish with apparent suddenness. 3000 BCE, 2000 BCE, the era of Anunnaki conflict, wars between divine factions, the destruction of the Sinai spaceport, the catastrophic events that end the Sumerian civilization, radioactive fallout spreads across Mesopotamia. 2000 BCE, 1000 BCE, the gradual withdrawal of the Anunnaki from visible human affairs. The gods become less visible, more remote, more accessible through vision and prophecy than through direct encounter. Human civilization is left to develop on its own terms. 1000 BCE to present. The age of human civilization without the direct presence of the Anunnaki. But carrying within our genes, our traditions, our sacred texts, and our deepest intuitions the memory of what we were, what was done to us, and the promise of what is yet to come. The question that remains. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer to the human genome, from the pre-flood kings whose reign spans numbered in the tens of thousands of years to the molecular structure of chromosome 2, from the mines of ancient Africa to the radioactive ruins of ancient cities, from the divine family of Anu, Enki, Enlil, and Ninhursag to the mystery schools that preserved their knowledge across the millennia. At the end of all of it, we are left with a question that the ancient texts themselves seem to want us to ask. Not the question of whether the Anunnaki existed. The clay tablets either record something real or they don't, and that is an empirical question that future archaeology and genetics may yet answer. But a deeper question, a more personal question. If all of this is true, if we were created by beings from another world to serve as a workforce in a mining operation, if our genetic heritage is the product of deliberate engineering rather than natural evolution, if our civilization was built with outside assistance, and our religions are the dim memory of direct contact with non-human intelligences, then what does that mean for us? What does it mean for who we are and who we can become? Here is what it might mean. It means that the mystery of human consciousness, the fact that we are aware of our own existence, that we ask why, that we reach for transcendence and beauty and meaning with a persistence that no evolutionary pressure strictly requires, is not an accident. It was built into us. We were designed to wonder. We were designed to reach, not just to dig gold, but to be the kind of beings who would eventually look up from the mine and ask about the stars. It means that the enormous gap between human potential and ordinary human achievement, the fact that by virtually every measure, human beings are capable of far more than most of us ever actualize, is not a failure. It is a feature of our design. We were made with more capacity than we needed for the work we were initially assigned, because the beings who made us were thinking ahead, were thinking about what we might become, not just what we were for. It means that the longing we feel, the persistent, inarticulate sense that something is missing, that we have forgotten something important, that the world as we find it is less than the world as it could be, is the echo of a memory, the genetic memory of a time when the beings who made us were here among us, when the relationship was direct and the presence was real, and the distant promise of a time when it might be that way again. And it means, perhaps most importantly, that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the universe into which we were born is not an indifferent void, but a populated place, full of intelligences older and wiser and stranger than we can easily imagine. That we ourselves are the evidence of that population, the proof written into our chromosomes, that intelligence from beyond this world reached down into the life of this planet and touched it, changed it, made it something it would not have been otherwise, made it us, the clay tablet and the mirror. Somewhere in the British Museum in London, in a climate-controlled storage facility with humidity controls and acid-free archival boxes, there is a clay tablet. It is approximately 4,000 years old. It is roughly the size of a paperback book, and pressed into its surface in wedge-shaped marks made by a reed stylus by a scribe who died 4 millennia ago is a record of something older still. The tablet records the names of kings. It records the lengths of their reigns. It records the number of years, and the number is 241,200, during which the gods ruled the earth before the great flood came and everything changed. The scribe who pressed those marks into the clay did not invent the information. He copied it from an older tablet, which was a copy of an older tablet still, which was itself copied from records that reached back into a time before tablets, into the oral traditions of the world's oldest civilization, into the living memory of people who remembered, or who had been told by those who remembered, or who had been told by those who had been told, what the world was like before the flood. What the world was like when the gods were here. That scribe did not know we would exist. He did not know that 4,000 years after he pressed his stylus into that clay, a species of 6 billion people would have spread across every corner of the planet he knew, would have built machines that could think, and vehicles that could fly, and weapons that could level cities in a moment. He did not know that we would pull his tablet out of the ground, that we would decode his writing, that we would sit in our comfortable homes in the 21st century and read what he wrote and ask, as we are asking tonight, is this true? Is this real? Were the gods real? But perhaps the beings he was writing about, perhaps the Anunnaki themselves, knew we would be here. Perhaps they knew that their story would survive the flood, survive the empires, survive the centuries, encoded in clay and in stone, and in the sacred texts of a dozen religions, and in the double helix of every human cell. Perhaps they made sure of it. Perhaps the entire apparatus of recorded religion and sacred tradition is their message to us, not from the past, but across time, aimed with precision at this specific moment when humanity has developed enough to begin to understand what the message is actually saying. The clay tablet is 4,000 years old. The story it tells is 400,000 years old, and we are reading it right now in the 21st century. And the question it puts to us is the same question it has always put to everyone who has encountered it. What if it's true? What if the gods were real and they made us and they left and they're watching? What if 241,200 years of divine rule over this planet left a legacy that we are still living inside of? That the religions we practice, the wars we fight, the longing for something greater that every human being carries somewhere in the center of themselves, are all the afterglow of an encounter so overwhelming that it has never fully faded? What if the question of where we came from is not a mystery at all, but a secret, kept not by the absence of evidence, but by the assumption that the evidence we have cannot possibly mean what it seems to mean? The tablet is sitting in the museum. The genome is sitting in every cell of your body. The stars are where they have always been. And somewhere out there, if the ancient texts are to be believed, the Anunnaki are waiting. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.